Hey guys, tonight we begin with a role that looked glamorous from the outside but was really just years of back-breaking labour, humiliation, and hoping you didn't get killed before you even earned your spurs. We're talking about the life of a knight squire in medieval times, where childhood ended at 7, and your career was spent polishing someone else's armour while they got all the glory. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're 7 years old, maybe 8 if your parents were feeling unusually sentimental. Either way, childhood as you knew it just ended. Not gradually, not gently, but with the finality of a castle gate slamming shut. Your father, if he's a minor noble with ambitions bigger than his purse, has arranged for you to serve as a page in the household of a more powerful lord. Your mother weeps quietly, your siblings wave from the courtyard, and you're loaded onto a cart with a small bundle of clothes and absolutely no idea what's coming. Welcome to the first rung of the ladder toward knighthood, a ladder made entirely of exhaustion, humiliation, and someone else's dirty laundry. The journey to your new home feels like travelling to another world, and in a way, it is. The castle looms ahead, all stone and banners and the faint smell of something that might be cooking or might be the moat. You're not sure. Either way, it's too late to turn back. The adults who greet you aren't cruel exactly, but they're not warm either. You're a resource now, a future investment, and investments don't get bedtime stories. You're shown to the page's quarters, a drafty room you'll share with a dozen other boys ranging from terrified to aggressively confident. The older ones size you up immediately. They've been here longer, they know the rules, and they're more than happy to remind you that you know nothing. Your first night is sleepless. The bed is a thin straw mattress that smells faintly of the last boy who used it. The stone walls radiate cold. Somewhere down the hall a guard is laughing too loudly. You lie there in the dark, clutching your blanket, wondering if this is what glory feels like. Spoiler, it doesn't. This is just the beginning. The prologue to a decade of service where you'll learn that knighthood isn't about bravery or honour. It's about survival, patience, and the ability to carry a tray without spilling while someone insults your posture. Morning comes early, too early. Before the sun has fully decided to participate in the day, a bell clangs somewhere in the castle, and you're expected to be awake, dressed, and functional. There's no snooze button in medieval Europe. There's just a very irritated steward who will absolutely yell at you if you're late. And you will be late because you have no idea where anything is, how anything works, or why everyone else seems to know exactly what they're doing while you stumble around like a confused chicken. Your duties as a page are, to put it mildly, endless. You're basically a medieval intern, except there's no coffee runs because coffee hasn't been invented yet, and also you're a child. You wake the household, help serve breakfast, clear the tables, sweep the floors, run messages between the lord and his steward, fetch firewood, hold doors open for people who don't acknowledge your existence, and smile through all of it. Like this is somehow an honour. Because technically it is. You're being trained. Trained to serve, trained to endure, trained to understand that your comfort is the least important thing in any room. Meals are a particular kind of torture. You stand behind the high table while the lord, his family and their guests feast on roasted meats, fresh bread, and fruits you didn't even know existed. Your job is to pour wine, carve meat, and keep the platters full. You're not allowed to eat until they're finished, and when you finally do get food, it's the leftovers, cold, picked over, and honestly not worth the wait. But you eat it anyway because the alternative is hunger, and hunger makes the next 14-hour shift even worse. Then there's the education, which sounds noble until you realise it's less about enlightenment and more about memorisation and fear. You're taught Latin, though no one bothers to explain why. You learn the names of every noble family within 3 counties, their crests, their alliances, their feuds. You memorise prayers, etiquette, and the proper way to address everyone from a duke to a visiting bishop. And if you forget, if you stumble over a title or mix up a coat of arms, you're corrected, loudly, often in front of others. Because humiliation apparently is a teaching tool. Music and poetry are part of the curriculum too, because a proper knight is supposed to be cultured. You're handed a lute you don't know how to play and told to practice. You recite verses in a language you barely understand. And all the while you're thinking, I just wanted to learn how to fight, but fighting comes later, much later. Right now you're learning how to stand still, speak softly, and accept that your entire existence revolves around making someone else's life easier. By the time you collapse into bed each night, every muscle aches. Your hands are raw from carrying trays and scrubbing floors. Your brain is fogged from trying to remember which fork goes where and which Saint's Day is tomorrow. And yet, this is just the beginning. You're a page. You haven't even started the hard part yet. At around age 14, if you've survived the page years without getting dismissed, injured, or deciding that maybe farming wasn't so bad after all, you're promoted. Congratulations. You're now a squire. The title sounds impressive. The reality is that you've just unlocked a whole new level of medieval suffering, now with added responsibility and significantly heavier objects to carry. As a squire, your primary duty is to serve a specific knight, not the lord of the castle, but an actual, fully armoured, sword-wielding knight who will become your master, your teacher, and occasionally your worst nightmare. This knight is responsible for training you in the art of combat, chivalry, and warfare. But before any of that happens, you're responsible for literally everything else in his life. Think of yourself as a personal assistant, valet, squire, and occasionally a human shield, all rolled into one exhausted teenager. Your day begins even earlier now. Knights like to train at dawn, which means you need to be awake before dawn. You stumble out of bed in the cold, pre-sunrise darkness, and immediately begin preparing your knight's equipment. And by equipment, I mean approximately 70 pounds of metal plates, chainmail, leather straps, and buckles that all need to be cleaned, polished, and assembled in exactly the right order. One wrong strap and the whole thing falls apart. Literally. Armour maintenance is an art form and a nightmare. Chainmail, for instance, needs to be oiled regularly to prevent rust. You spend hours rubbing each link with a rag soaked in animal fat, which leaves your hands greasy and smelling like something died near a forge. Plate armour requires polishing, endlessly. Any spot, scratch or hint of rust reflects poorly on your knight, and therefore on you. So you polish, and then polish some more. Your reflection in that breastplate better be clear enough to shave in, assuming you're old enough to shave, which you're probably not. Then there's the matter of dressing your knight. This isn't like helping someone into a coat. This is a complex multi-step process that requires strength, precision, and the ability to not drop a 40-pound breastplate on his foot. You start with the padding, thick quilted garments that go under the armour to prevent chafing and absorb impact. Then the chainmail, which you have to lift over his head without tangling it or catching his hair. Then the plate armour, piece by piece, greaves for the legs, cuirass for the chest, pauldrons for the shoulders, gauntlets for the hands, each piece strapped, buckled and tightened. If something's loose, it rattles. If something's too tight, he can't move. Either way, it's your fault. And don't even get me started on the helmet. Medieval helmets are heavy, hot, and incredibly claustrophobic. Your knight will complain about it later, but right now, your job is to make sure it fits correctly, that the visor moves smoothly, and that he can actually see out of the eye slits. Because a blind knight is a dead knight, and a dead knight means you're out of a job. Once he's fully armoured, you hand him his sword, his shield, and his lance if he's training for a joust. You also make sure his warhorse is ready, which is a whole separate ordeal we'll get to in a moment. But first, let's talk about what happens when training begins and you realise that your role isn't just to watch from the sidelines. Training is where the squire's job gets dangerous. You're not just holding your knight's spare equipment and nodding encouragingly, you're actively participating. Sometimes that means sparring with him using wooden swords that still hurt like hell when they connect with your ribs. Sometimes it means running drills, practicing footwork, learning how to hold a shield at the right angle so a lance doesn't shatter your arm. And sometimes it means standing perfectly still while your knight practices his swing, trusting that he won't accidentally take your head off. That trust, by the way, is often misplaced. Jousting practice is especially terrifying. If your knight is training for a tournament, you're the one setting up the quintain, a rotating wooden dummy with a shield on one side and a sandbag on the other. The idea is that the knight charges, hits the shield, and dodges the sandbag as it swings around. Your job is to reset it after every pass, which means standing uncomfortably close to a spinning wooden arm that absolutely will knock you unconscious if your timing is off. Many squires learned this lesson the hard way. waking up in the dirt with a headache and a new appreciation for the phrase hazard pay. Then there are the weapons. You're responsible for maintaining all of them. Swords need sharpening, blades need oiling, shields need repairing when they inevitably get smashed during practice. You spend hours at the whetstone grinding edges to perfection, hoping you don't slip and take off a finger. You learn to recognise the sound of a properly balanced blade, the weight of a well-made lance, the weak points in a battered shield. It's an education, sure, but it's an education written in splinters, bruises, and the constant fear that you're one mistake away from ruining a very expensive piece of equipment. And when training is over, your work isn't. You help your knight out of his armour piece by piece, the process somehow even slower in reverse. You inspect every strap, every buckle, every joint for damage. You clean off the sweat, the mud, the occasional blood. You store everything carefully because if something goes missing or gets damaged overnight, that's on you. Then, and only then, do you get to collapse for a few minutes before the next round of duties begins. Being a squire isn't about learning honour or chivalry. It's about endurance. It's about accepting that your body will ache, your hands will blister, and your pride will be bruised daily. It's about understanding that knighthood, if you ever reach it, is earned not through glory, but through years of silent, invisible labour that no one will ever thank you for. If you thought armour was the hardest, part of a squire's life, congratulations. You were adorably wrong, because now we need to talk about the warhorse, the creature that weighs over 1,000 pounds, costs more than a small village, and has exactly zero interest in your convenience. Your knight's destrier, the medieval warhorse, is a living weapon. It's been bred for size, strength, and aggression. It's trained to charge into battle, to trample enemies, to remain calm while arrows fly and men scream. It is magnificent, it is terrifying, and it is now your responsibility, every single day, forever. Caring for a warhorse is a full-time job disguised as a side quest. You're responsible for feeding it, grooming it, exercising it, and making sure it doesn't die from any number of medieval horse ailments that no one fully understands. The horse eats better than you do. Oats, barley, fresh hay, and occasionally treats like apples or honey-soaked bread. You, meanwhile, are still eating cold leftovers from last night's feast. But the horse gets a menu. Grooming is an endless ritual. Every morning you brush the horse's coat until it gleams. You pick stones and mud out of its hooves, a process that requires crouching under a half-ton animal that may or may not decide to shift its weight onto your foot. You check for injuries, sores, or signs of illness. You oil its hooves to prevent cracking. You comb its mane and tail, removing tangles and debris. And all the while the horse stands there, occasionally swishing its tail into your face, or snorting in what you can only assume is disdain. Then there's the tack. The saddle alone weighs nearly as much as you do, and it needs to be cleaned, oiled, and inspected regularly. The bridle, the reins, the stirrups, all of it requires maintenance. Leather cracks, metal rusts, stitching frays, and if any of it fails during a charge, your knight could be thrown, injured, or killed, which means you'll be blamed, so you check everything, twice, 3 times if you're smart. Saddling the warhorse is an event. You heave the saddle onto its back, making sure the weight is distributed evenly. You tighten the girth strap, pulling hard enough to secure it, but not so hard that the horse decides you're the enemy. You attach the stirrups, adjust the bridle, and make sure the bit sits correctly in its mouth. Every step has to be perfect. One loose strap, one twisted rein, and the whole thing can go catastrophically wrong. And then, of course, there's the barding. The horse's armour, because apparently it wasn't enough that you had to dress your knight in 70 pounds of steel. Now you get to do the same thing for a creature that outweighs him by a factor of 10. The barding includes a chanfron for the head, a crinny for the neck, and plates for the chest and flanks. Each piece is heavy, awkward, and requires 2 people to lift. Except there's usually only one person available, you, so you learn to manoeuvre these massive plates of metal, balancing them on your shoulder, sliding them into place and buckling them securely, while the horse shifts impatiently and occasionally tries to bite you. Horses, by the way, have opinions, strong opinions, about everything. Some days your knight's destrier is calm and cooperative. Other days it wakes up and chooses violence. It might refuse to be saddled. It might kick at you when you're cleaning its hooves. It might decide that today is the day it's going to test whether you're fast enough to dodge 1,000 pounds of annoyed warhorse. Spoiler, you're usually not. But despite all of this, despite the bites, the kicks, the endless grooming, and the sheer exhausting weight of it all, you learn something important. You learn to respect the horse. Because this animal, temperamental as it is a warrior. It's been trained to charge into the chaos of battle without hesitation. It trusts your knight with its life. And slowly, painfully, it begins to trust you too. That trust is earned through consistency, patience, and the understanding that in medieval warfare, the horse is just as vital as the man who rides it. Maybe more so you care for it. You polish its hooves and braid its mane. You whisper to it on cold mornings and make sure it's fed before you eat. Because one day when your knight rides into battle, that horse will carry him through hell, and you'll be the one who made sure it was ready. Let's talk about food. Or more accurately, let's talk about the fact that as a squire, food is something that happens to other people while you watch and quietly starve. Meal times in a medieval castle are theatrical productions. The lord sits at the high table surrounded by his family, honoured guests and knights. The hall smells of roasted meat, fresh bread, and spiced wine. Servants move between the tables carrying platters piled high with venison, pork, roasted birds, and pies stuffed with things you can't even identify. It's a feast for the senses. Unfortunately, your senses will have to wait. Your job during meals is to serve. You stand behind your knight, alert and ready. When his cup is empty, you fill it. When his plate needs more meat, you carve it. When he gestures vaguely in the direction of the salt, you're expected to interpret that gesture with psychic precision and deliver the salt before he has to gesture again. You're a mind reader, a waiter, and a shadow, all at once, and you do this for hours, while the smell of food surrounds you, while your stomach growls loudly enough that you're convinced the entire hall can hear it, while you watch everyone else eat. When the feast finally ends, when the lord and his guests retire to the solar for wine and conversation, when the knights push back from the table with satisfied groans, then and only then do you get to eat. You're directed to a side table where the servants gather. The food that's left is cold, the bread is hard, the meat is mostly gristle, the wine has been watered down so much it's basically disappointed grape juice. But you're hungry enough that it doesn't matter. You shovel it down knowing that this might be your only real meal of the day, and even this is interrupted by someone shouting that your knight needs his boots cleaned or his armour inspected or some other task that absolutely could have waited but apparently can't. On campaign, it's worse. So much worse. When your knight rides to war, you go with him, which means days, sometimes weeks, of marching through mud, rain and terrain that seems personally offended by your existence. There are no castles, no kitchens, no feasts, just whatever you can scavenge, beg or steal. Rations on campaign are grim. Hard biscuits that could double as building materials, salted pork so tough you have to soak it in water just to make it chewable, dried beans, stale bread. Occasionally, if you're lucky, someone kills a deer or a pig, and there's fresh meat for a night, but that meat goes to the knights first, then the men-at-arms, then the archers, then the camp followers, and finally, if there's anything left, the squires. Often, there isn't. You learn to eat quickly, not because you're in a hurry, but because if you don't, someone will take your portion. Hunger becomes a constant companion. You wake up hungry, you march hungry, you fall asleep hungry, and the next day, you do it all again. Water is another problem. You can't just drink from any river or stream. Some are contaminated, some are downstream from a camp that's been using it as a latrine. So you learn to look for clear, fast-moving water. You learn to boil it when you can, and when you can't, you drink it anyway and hope for the best, because dehydration will kill you faster than bad water. Probably. There's also the issue of foraging. When supplies run low, squires are often sent out to find food. You wander through forests looking for berries, nuts, edible roots, anything that won't kill you. Sometimes you find a farm and trade for eggs or bread. Sometimes you find nothing. And sometimes you find something that looked edible but very much wasn't. And you spend the next 2 days wishing for death while your insides stage a violent rebellion. And through all of this, you're still expected to perform your duties. Still expected to care for the horse, maintain the armour, serve your knight. Hunger is not an excuse. Exhaustion is not an excuse. You're a squire. You endure. That's the job. So yes, food as a squire is less about nutrition and more about survival. It's about learning to function on scraps. It's about understanding that your comfort, your hunger, your basic needs are secondary to everyone else's. and it's about accepting that this is just how things are, at least until you're knighted, assuming you survive that long. Now let's talk about the one thing every squire dreamed of and simultaneously dreaded: actual combat. Because while you spent years polishing armour and grooming horses, the ultimate test wasn't how shiny you could make a breastplate. It was whether you could survive a battlefield. Here's the thing they don't tell you when you're a bright-eyed page imagining yourself as a future knight. Squires don't watch battles from a safe distance. You're not sitting on a hill with a nice view and a packed lunch. You're in it, right there in the chaos. And your job isn't to fight gloriously, it's to keep your knight alive. When your knight charges into battle, you follow. Not on a warhorse, mind you. Those are expensive and reserved for actual knights. You get a regular horse, or if you're unlucky, you're on foot. You carry your knight's spare weapons, his backup shield, extra lance tips, basically his entire mobile armoury. And when he breaks a lance or loses a sword in someone's ribcage, you have to be close enough to hand him a replacement before the enemy turns him into a very well-dressed corpse. This means you're riding or running directly into the part of the battlefield where armed men are actively trying to kill each other. Arrows are falling like rain. Cavalry is charging. Infantry is hacking at anything that moves. And you, a teenager with minimal armour and a bag full of sharp objects, are supposed to navigate this nightmare, find your knight, and deliver his backup equipment without dying. It's like the world's worst delivery service. Let's say you manage to reach your knight. Let's say he's still alive and just needs a fresh lance. You hand it to him. Congratulations. Now you have to survive the next 30 seconds while he rides off, and you're standing there, surrounded by chaos, with absolutely no one protecting you. Enemy soldiers don't care that you're a squire. They don't care that you're not technically a combatant. You're on a battlefield. You're fair game, so you learn to fight. Not in the glorious choreographed way your knight does. You learn to fight dirty. You carry a dagger, maybe a short sword if you're lucky. You learn to watch your surroundings, to keep moving, to never stand still long enough to become a target. You learn that honour is a luxury and survival is a necessity. When an enemy soldier comes at you, you don't challenge him to a duel. You stab him and run. But the worst part of battle isn't the fighting. It's the aftermath. When the clash is over, when the dust settles and the screams fade into groans, you have to find your knight. And sometimes he's fine, standing there, bloodied but victorious, ready to have you help him out of his dented armour. But sometimes he's not fine. Sometimes he's on the ground. Sometimes he's injured. And sometimes he's dead. If your knight is wounded, you have to get him off the battlefield. This is harder than it sounds. A fully armoured knight weighs as much as a small cart. If he's unconscious, you're dragging dead weight. If he's conscious but injured, he's in pain and possibly delirious. Either way, you're pulling him through mud, blood and corpses while trying not to get killed yourself. And if you fail, if you can't get him to safety, his death is on you. If your knight dies, your position dies with him. You're suddenly unemployed in the middle of a war zone. Some squires get reassigned to other knights. Some get sent home in disgrace. Some just disappear into the chaos, never to be heard from again. The battlefield doesn't care about your career plans. And let's not forget about the injuries you'll sustain. Squires got hurt all the time. Arrows didn't check your rank before hitting you. A stray sword swing didn't care if you were there to fight or just deliver equipment. You'd return to camp with cuts, bruises, broken bones, and medical care in the medieval period was, let's say, optimistic at best. A barber surgeon might stitch you up. Or he might decide that bloodletting is the answer to everything. Or he might just pour some wine on the wound and tell you to pray. If you got infected, which was common, you either fought it off or you died. Those were your options. But assuming you survived, assuming you made it through the battle with all your limbs intact and your knight still breathing, you weren't done. Because now came the cleanup. You had to strip your knight out of his armour, tend to his wounds, repair his equipment and care for his horse. All while you were exhausted, injured, and possibly suffering from what we'd now recognise as trauma, but what medieval people just called being tired. Combat for a squire wasn't glorious. It wasn't romantic, it was terrifying, chaotic and brutally unfair. But it was also the crucible. If you survived it, if you proved you could keep your head while everyone around you was losing theirs, literally and figuratively, then maybe, just maybe, you were ready for knighthood, assuming you lived long enough to get there. Let's talk about tournaments, which sound exciting until you realise they're just as dangerous as actual war, except everyone's pretending it's entertainment. Tournaments were a big deal in medieval Europe. They were part sporting event, part social gathering, part political theatre. Knights came from all over to compete, show off their skills and win glory, prizes and the favour of noble ladies who watched from the stands and occasionally threw flowers or handkerchiefs, which was apparently peak medieval romance. For a knight, tournaments were an opportunity. For a squire, they were a logistical nightmare. Your work begins days before the tournament even starts. Your knight needs to look perfect. His armour needs to be polished until it blinds people. His weapons need to be sharpened, balanced and inspected. His horse needs to be groomed to within an inch of its life. And his banner, the colourful flag that represents his house, needs to be clean, properly displayed, and free of any embarrassing stains from the last tournament. Then there's the matter of transportation. You have to get your knight, his equipment, his horse, and yourself to the tournament grounds. This usually involves several days of travel. You're responsible for packing everything, loading it onto carts, making sure nothing gets lost or damaged, and setting up camp once you arrive. You're basically a medieval roadie, except instead of guitars and amps, you're hauling swords and armour. When you arrive at the tournament grounds, the real work begins. You set up your knight's pavilion, a fancy tent where he can rest between bouts. You arrange his armour on display so that other knights and spectators can admire it. You make sure his horse is stabled, fed, and ready. And you spend hours polishing, adjusting and preparing, because your knight's reputation is on the line, and if he looks bad, you look worse. The tournament itself is structured chaos. There's the melee, where groups of knights fight each other in a mock battle. There's the joust, where two knights charge at each other with lances and try to knock each other off their horses. And there are smaller contests, sword fighting, archery, wrestling. Your knight might compete in all of them, which means you need to have all his equipment ready, all the time. Jousting is particularly stressful. Your knight rides out onto the field, lance in hand, and charges at his opponent. You're standing at the edge of the arena, holding his spare lances, spare shield, and a prayer that nothing goes wrong. When the lances shatter on impact, which they often do, you run out onto the field and hand him a new one. You do this while the crowd watches, while your knight is catching his breath, and while his opponent is also getting ready for another pass. Speed and precision matter. Fumble the handoff and your knight looks incompetent, and guess whose fault that is. Then there are the injuries. Tournaments were supposed to be safer than real battles, but safer is relative. Knights still got hurt. Badly. Lances could splinter and pierce through armour. Falls from horses could break bones. Blows to the head could cause concussions or worse. When your knight gets injured, you're the one who has to help him off the field, remove his armour and get him to a physician. And if the injury is serious, if he's bleeding or unconscious, you're doing all of this while panicking internally and trying to look calm externally. But even if your knight does well, even if he wins his bouts and earns applause and prizes, your work isn't done. After the tournament you have to pack everything up again. You have to clean and repair the armour, which is now dented, scratched and possibly covered in blood. You have to care for the horse, which is exhausted. And you have to travel back home, knowing that in a few months there will be another tournament, and you'll do this all over again. Tournaments weren't just physically exhausting, they were mentally draining. Because unlike a real battle, where survival is the only goal, tournaments had expectations. Your knight was supposed to perform well, to look good, to uphold his honour. And if he failed, if he was knocked from his horse in the first pass or defeated in the melee, it reflected on his skill, his house, and by extension, you. Because clearly, if he lost, it must have been because you didn't prepare him properly. So you learn to manage the pressure. You learn to work quickly, efficiently, and without complaint. You learned that tournaments, for all their pageantry and spectacle, were just another form of labour, another test, another opportunity to prove that you could handle the impossible and make it look easy. And maybe, if you were lucky, you got to watch some of the actual jousting, from a distance, while holding a broken lance and wondering if this was really what glory looked like. Here's a fun fact about being a squire. You had almost no personal life. Romance? Forget it. Free time? Doesn't exist. Privacy? Absolutely not. Your entire existence revolved around your duties, and anything else was considered a distraction at best and insubordination at worst. Let's start with the obvious. You're young, probably somewhere between 14 and 21. This is historically the age when people have feelings, hormones, and a general interest in other human beings. But if you're a squire, those feelings are going to have to wait. because you don't have time to court anyone. You're too busy polishing stirrups. In theory, chivalric romance was a huge part of medieval culture. Knights were supposed to have ladies they admired from afar, noble women they pledged their loyalty to in exchange for a smile or a ribbon. It was all very poetic, and absolutely none of it applied to you. Squires weren't part of the courtly love game, you were staff. And staff didn't get to moon over the lord's daughter, or write sad poems about unrequited affection. If you did develop feelings for someone, you kept it to yourself. Because getting caught flirting with a serving girl, or heaven forbid a noblewoman, could get you dismissed, beaten, or worse. The rules were clear. You were there to serve, not to socialise. Your knight's honour was tied to your behaviour, and if you embarrassed him by getting involved in some romantic scandal, he'd make sure you regretted it. But let's say you were smart about it. Let's say you managed to exchange a few words with someone during a feast or a festival. Maybe you made a connection. Congratulations. Now you have to figure out how to maintain any kind of relationship when you're working 18-hour days, travelling constantly, and sharing sleeping quarters with a dozen other squires who will absolutely mock you if they find out. Letter writing wasn't an option for most squires. You might not be literate, and even if you were, parchment was expensive, and private correspondence was nearly impossible. So any relationship you tried to maintain was limited to brief, stolen moments. A conversation in a hallway, a glance across a crowded hall, maybe a shared laugh while fetching water from the well. It wasn't much. But it was all you had. And then there was the exhaustion. Even if you had time for romance, even if you found someone who was interested, you were too tired to do anything about it. After a full day of training, serving, and manual labour, the idea of staying up late to whisper sweet nothings was laughable. You wanted sleep. That was your romance. You and your straw mattress together at last. As for friendships, those were complicated too. You bonded with the other squires, sure. You shared the same struggles, the same exhaustion, the same fear of screwing up. But there was also competition. Only so many squires would be knighted. Only so many would succeed. So every friendship came with an undercurrent of rivalry. You helped each other, but you also watched each other, measuring yourselves against your peers, wondering who would make it and who wouldn't. The older squires often hazed the younger ones. It wasn't malicious exactly, it was tradition. They'd gone through it, so now you had to as well. Pranks, insults, impossible tasks assigned as a joke. You learned to laugh it off, to take it in stride. Because complaining made it worse, and besides, in a year or two you'd be doing the same thing to the next batch of new squires. In short, being a squire meant putting your personal life on hold indefinitely. Your youth, your interests, your desires, all of it took a backseat to duty. You weren't a person with needs and wants. You were a squire, and squires didn't get to be individuals. They got to serve. So if you survived the training, the battles, the tournaments, and the endless manual labour, congratulations. You've reached the final stage, the moment you've been working toward for over a decade. The ceremony where you're finally, officially, recognised as a knight. It should be glorious. It should feel like victory. And it does. Sort of. If you ignore the part where you're broke, exhausted, and not entirely sure what happens next, the knighting ceremony is one of the most important rituals in medieval culture. It's solemn, symbolic, and expensive. Very expensive. Because even though you're the one being honoured, you're also the one paying for it. Or rather, your family is. The costs include new armour, a new sword, a feast for your fellow knights, and gifts for the lord who's knighting you. If your family can't afford it, you might have to delay your knighthood until you can. Some squires never get knighted because they simply can't pay for the ceremony. But let's assume you've scraped together the funds. The night before the ceremony, you participate in something called the vigil. You spend the entire night in a chapel, kneeling in prayer, reflecting on your future responsibilities. You're not allowed to sleep, you're not allowed to leave. You're alone with your thoughts, your aching knees, and the growing realization that this is it. After tomorrow, everything changes. When morning comes, you're dressed in white robes, symbolizing purity. You attend Mass, you take communion, and then finally you're brought before your lord or the knight who has agreed to perform the ceremony. You kneel. He places the flat of his sword on your shoulder and speaks the words that make it official. In the name of God, St. Michael and St. George, I dub thee knight. That's it. You're done. You stand. No longer a squire, but a knight. There's applause, there's celebration. There's a feast in your honour where everyone drinks and toasts your success, and for a few hours you let yourself believe that it was all worth it. But reality sets in quickly. Being a knight isn't the end of the journey, it's the beginning of a new one. You're expected to maintain your own armour now, to care for your own horse, to find your own squire and train him the way you were trained. You're expected to fight in your lord's wars, to uphold the code of chivalry, and to live up to the reputation of your title. And here's the kicker. Most knights weren't wealthy. Unless you inherited land or married into money, you were basically a professional soldier with better equipment and a fancier title. You still had to work for your lord. You still had to prove your worth. You still had to survive. Some knights thrived. They won tournaments, earned rewards, and built reputations that echoed through history. Others struggled, living modestly, fighting in endless campaigns, and wondering if this was really what they'd spent their entire youth working toward. A few became disillusioned, realizing that the romantic ideal of knighthood, the honour, the glory, the chivalry, didn't quite match the reality of politics, violence, and survival. But whether you succeeded or struggled, whether you became a legend or faded into obscurity, you carried with you the knowledge that you'd earned it. Every polished piece of armour, every hour spent caring for a horse, every meal you'd served while starving, every battle you'd survived, every impossible task you'd completed without complaint. All of it had led to this moment. You were a knight now, and that meant something. Even if no one remembered your name, even if history forgot you, you knew. You'd survived the years of being a squire, and that, in itself, was a kind of victory. So here's the truth about being a knight squire in medieval times. It sucked. There's no romantic way to spin it. It was years of back-breaking labour, humiliation, danger, and exhaustion. You spent your teenage years serving someone else, sacrificing your comfort, your safety, and occasionally your dignity, all for the chance to maybe someday earn a title that might not even improve your life. But it was also something else. It was a test of endurance, resilience, and willpower. The squires who made it through, who survived the training, the battles, and the endless grind, came out the other side as something different, harder, stronger, capable of handling things most people couldn't imagine. The life of a squire wasn't about glory, it was about survival. And in the end, the ones who made it through didn't just become knights. They became the kind of people who could endure anything. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real lesson all along.